Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alright, this video is just going to be a one-shot standalone video in which we'll look at an essay that Merleau-Ponty wrote. I think it was a few years after Phenomenology of Perception. The essay is called The Child's Relations with Others. It's not something I probably would have come to on my own. It sounds very child psychology-ish, and it is, but Merleau-Ponty really ties in the ideas in the essay. He ties them in really nicely with the ideas that he develops in Phenomenology of Perception, particularly regarding, as the title suggests, our relations with others, but also the development of the self, or the cogito. So it all comes in together quite nicely, and it's only about 40 pages. It's not a dense read, so if you have time, check it out, and then hopefully this video will explain or clarify some of the points, or at least summarize something from the essay. And we will start then with the first section, which will look at classical psychology and the opinions that were kind of prevalent in Merleau-Ponty's time. So the first thing that he talks about is the psyche, and the psyche was typically believed to be what is given to only one person. So the psyche, you only have access to your own psyche. It's something you only know from within, something therefore that other people can't know. By definition, it's incommunicable, essentially. That's the idea. So we're talking about the self, the cogito, psyche. These are all fairly interchangeable terms. And that's the first tenet that Merleau-Ponty's going to question, this idea that the self is purely inward, purely internal, and isolated. The second idea that he's going to question is the idea that my body is also, or that, first of all, that my body is knowable to me through the mass of sensations that it gives me. And he calls this synesthesia. But if that's true, my body is known to me only through the sensations I receive from it, then it's something that fundamentally is incommunicable again, like the self. So it's something that only I can know. Other people have no way of getting any genuine understanding of my body, because it's something that only I can experience. Again, isolated, locked away, internal. So those are the two ideas that Merleau-Ponty is really going to bring into question. If these are true, if it's true that the psyche is isolated, that my body is only knowable to me, then the only way we can actually know others, the only way we can have a relation with others, with other people, with other selves, with other bodies, is by analogy. So I have to, when I see, I know that my body is associated with my mind, myself. So when I see another body out there that looks like mine, doing things similar to what my body does, then I'm inferring, but perhaps there's a self in there as well. And so that's if this is true, this classical psychological model, then the only way we can understand others, we can know them, is through an inference, through by analogy. But if we consider infants, and the first thing we have to say about infants then is that even though they obviously can't communicate, they don't have any kind of conceptual understanding of other people around them, or even themselves, their own bodies and things, they're nevertheless highly attuned to what's going on around them, and they're able to have relations with others, with other people, that are noticeably different from their interactions with inanimate objects. So there's a difference immediately, even at the infant stage, whereby a relationship with others is experienced in some way. And if the only way we're able to do that is through analogy, then we have two problems. The first is that to make an analogy like this, to draw an inference from what I see out there to from what I know happens in my body and mind to what happens in another body that looks like mine, that's a fairly complex intellectual act. It requires, it relates my knowledge or experience of the other to an association or a judgment, and that is something that an infant's just not capable of, right? So they're able to establish this relation with others different from the way that they act with inanimate objects, and yet they're unable to draw any inferences from their own bodies to others. And they don't even know their own bodies yet, but there's still this immediate understanding, this recognition, this relation that they're able to cultivate. So it doesn't explain that the current, or the psychological model of Merleau-Ponty's time doesn't explain that. I don't know if it's changed much. I haven't paid any attention to modern psychology, so this is all, I'm placing this all back in kind of mid 20th century psychology. But the other problem was in making the analogy. So he talks specifically about the infant seeing an adult smile and reacting by smiling themselves. And if this is an analogy, if that's what's happening, the infant has to compare the smile of the other person, which they see, which is an image for them, to their own mouth, which they have never seen. And they have to understand that smiling themselves is mirroring what's happening in the face of the adult that they're looking at. And there seems to be no way to make that conceptual leap, to go from an image which I see to mapping that onto a part of my body which I've never seen. So again, the psychological model just doesn't seem to explain how an infant can have these relations with others. And for that, we'll how we can overcome that, we'll look at what Merleau-Ponty has to say about this. So first of all, Merleau-Ponty's model, he is going to reject the notion that consciousness is originally isolated and turned inwards. So instead, he says, consciousness is turned towards the world. So it's something that's externally directed. It's out there in the world. It's rather than being thinking of it as kind of my thoughts, my mind. These things are intangible. They're completely isolated and internal. He identifies consciousness as a manner of relating to the world, a conduct, an action at work in the world. So it's really broadening our typical understanding of what consciousness is. It's not just the thoughts that you have, the internal monologue that's running through your mind, or the images that you bring up, that you imagine, that you perceive. It's something which is out there. It's manifest in the way that we live in the world. So that was the first thing. The second thing, obviously, he rejects that the body is knowable only as a mass of sensations, or that it's knowable originally or primarily as a mass of sensations. Instead, the body is a whole unified system, and he calls it in the essay a postural schema, which is known in relation to the environment. So again, it's not something that I don't know my body through the internal sensations I have of it. I know it through moving around the world, through interacting with things in the world, through touching things, grasping and moving towards things. It's that which gives me a more fuller, a more complete understanding of my body than just the sensations I receive from it. Of course, that's a part of it, but the idea is that, again, it's a broader idea of how we come to understand our body, how we come to know our body, our bodies. And so this way that Merleau-Ponty is relating our consciousness and our bodies to the world, so grounding them in the world, means that there's then a common denominator for understanding the other in relation to me. So now, if I am not primordially an inward, isolated consciousness with a body that I only know through my own sensations, rather, if I am an externally directed action, manner of an action in the world, a manner of taking up the world, and my body is something which is known through that world, then it's the same as true for the other's psyche and for the other's body as well. So now we have this, the world is kind of the meeting point. It's this, I'm grounded in the world, the other is grounded in the world as well, and through that then we're able to have a fuller, more complete relation with the other than we're able to get if we're just kind of locked away and having to guess, to draw analogies. So he overcomes that isolation that's built into that original model. And there are two phases that he's going to talk about in the essay. The first phase is a pre-communication phase. And one expression he uses to describe this is that of an anonymous collectivity. So here the other's intentions play across my body while mine play across theirs. And basic idea here is that the other and I are two parts of a system. So the system is a totality, it's a whole. And I and the other are just two parts within that whole. So there's just at this stage, this first phase, there aren't two separate entities. There's one entity with two poles, you might say, two parts that are not identical, but not completely divided either. So that's the first stage. Another way I've put this is, maybe I'm just repeating myself, but we have an awareness of our own body and the other's body as two moments of a single totality. So that's a nice way of putting it. That's a quote, by the way. Two moments of a single totality. That's just getting to that idea. This is that system, me and other. The system is a whole, not two divided things. And so anyway, that's the first phase. The second phase is based on that original me and other phase. A stronger segregation occurs in which I come to see my psyche and my body as separate from the other. And so, that's the second phase, and we'll look at what that means as we go through the video. But importantly, just to note, I'll note this at the end as well, that second phase where there's this isolation, this separation between me and the other, it's never complete. It's never a complete severing of that original me and other totality. So although it seems that way, and we typically think of it as being complete break. It's never total. And as like I say, as the video progresses, we'll talk about how it's kind of preserved in adulthood. But anyway, let's turn to the first section. Let's turn to the next section, which is going to describe how the child develops. And we'll go right through from birth to 3 years old. And that will cover both of those phases that I just talked about. Okay, so the first phase in the development of the child we'll look at from birth to 6 months. And during this time, the defining feature really is that the infant has no awareness, no external awareness directly. So they're not aware of anything going on around them explicitly as things happening external to them. They're obviously aware of and they're receptive to changes in the environment, but they're only receptive insofar as those changes affect the child internally. So that is, nothing's developed. They're not able to see even something out there, someone else. There's something they have to learn. They have to bring all of these, their sensory organs. They have to kind of build them up before they're able to get a picture of what's going on. So that there's the only kind of experience they have, their whole world is locked up within themselves, and that's the only way that they experience. And Merleau-Ponty calls this introception. So they only have knowledge, or they only experience through introception. There's no sense of an external world or other people. But again, they are extremely responsive to the environment, but just insofar as that environment registers changes internally. After 6 months, however, we get this change to what he calls the syncretic system, me and other. And that's a hyphenated term, me and other. So that's that totality we talked about in the last section. Here, the child becomes aware of their body, but this is still kind of rudimentary and confused. So we're still in that pre-communication phase, that first phase that I mentioned. The major contributing factor to the child becoming aware of their body is what Merleau-Ponty describes as the specular image. And this is basically just, this is your own mirror image. And which we recognize ourselves in the mirror. We get the specular image at around 8 months old. But the important thing here is that this is not understood as a concept. So when we see ourselves in the mirror and first recognize ourselves in the mirror, we're not understanding conceptually that image and my body are one and the same thing. When we don't have that mental, intellectual grasp of what's happening, it's not understood as a concept. Instead, the image, even though we're aware that image is my image, the mirror image, the specular image, still retains something of a quasi-presence, Merleau-Ponty calls it. And he means that it's not, we don't recognize it as something, as just me. It retains some kind of presence for us. It retains some kind of meaning external to me at this stage. So it still has that feature, and that ties in with what I'm saying about the child is aware of their body, but it's still a rudimentary. It's still not. I'm still not clearly separating myself and others. But what the specular image does is allows me to see myself for the first time, and to understand myself as a body like the bodies of others that I see around me. It gives me an image which I never had before. So it's that which allows that system, me and other, to first start to emerge. And it was interesting. He says the image still has a quasi-presence for the child, and he says that this even persists into adulthood. So again, if you remember when I talked about that separation never being complete, it's always kind of underneath the separation. There's still this sense of connection. And that this is one way that it's manifested in this specular image, which never fully loses its sense of quasi-presenceness to us. Quasi-presenceness, that's definitely not a word. And the example he gives is if you've got a photo of someone's face and it's on the ground, you might stop, you might hesitate before you stand on it, because it's someone's face. It's like it's not the person, obviously, but it's also not like a picture of a tree or a table or something. It has some kind of presence, some kind of sense for us, and that retains even a doubt. And you may stand on it, but you certainly wouldn't stomp on it unless you're actually that could, because if you did that, you're making a statement, right? You're kind of attacking that person, even though it's just a picture. But so there's that sense where the image, a mirror image, it never fully separates from the person. We always have that sense of it being of having some meaning, more meaning than inanimate objects anyway. So given that this specular image then isn't understood originally as a concept, Merleau-Ponty wants to relate it to something other than knowledge, and we'll do that now. So we've got this distinction. Well, there's no distinction made between interoception and external perception for the child at this stage. Like I say, that they're aware of their body for the first time as an image, but there's still, everything's still happening in a kind of collectivity, that anonymous collectivity. And he talks about this as being resulting in a global identification of the child with their specular image, as well as with the image of the other's body. So there's the child's aware that there's another body, and that there's this specular image which is my body, but they all kind of fit into this one system. It's not, things aren't completely separated. So the child then, he says, feels they are in the other's body and in their own visual image. So the child doesn't make that distinction. There is no clear separation made here. They're aware that there is my body here, the other's body there, my specular image there, but there's no strict separation, division made between these things. And that's really crucial to Merleau-Ponty's idea, Merleau-Ponty's model here. So this specular image then, it basically allows the child to become a spectator of themselves for the first time. They now have, they know their body not just from the inside, as it were, but they're aware of their body as an image which is presented to other people as well. And what this does then is, it's quite a nice phrase that Merleau-Ponty uses here, that the specular image is derealizing. So by that he means it turns the child away from what they actually are, which is that first person lived experience, to what they then see themselves to be. So it introduces an element of a kind of third person perspective into the child's world, into the child's understanding of themselves. And it's this introduction of that third person perspective, that derealizing, which creates that system, me and other. And it's this which means that the creation of this system means that what we have here, what we're dealing with, is not knowledge. Rather, we're dealing with relations of being. So remember earlier I said Merleau-Ponty wants to relate this specular image to something other than knowledge. Well, this is what he's doing. He's relating it to, instead of knowledge, to being, our relations of being, i.e. the way that we relate to ourselves and to others. So it's a change that again, it's not conceptual. It's not just an intellectual, superficial understanding. Rather, it goes to the core of our relations with others in the world, and even to relation of ourselves, the way that we relate to ourselves, the way we understand ourselves. So it affects our lived experience, our actual being, relations of being with people. Another way to understand this is to note that the specular image doesn't bring the child to understand that the visual image and the tactile image of their body are one and the same. That would be a synthesis of an intellectual kind or of knowledge. Rather, it brings them to understand that the image is their image and is the appearance they present to others. And that is a synthesis of coexistence with others. That's a synthesis that is more characterized by being rather than knowledge. Then we talk about syncretic sociability after that. And this is an idea, that's a term used by Henri Wallin, who Merleau-Ponty references quite a lot. And so at this stage we're talking about the age between 6 months and 1 year still. But what Wallin notices here is that there's an explosion of sociability. And the idea here is that our relations with others become more complex. Although, of course, still set within this syncretic system, me and other. So we're still not isolated, we're still not divided from the other yet. There's still this this totality that's dominating our relations. And some of the things that he talks about, one of the key points he talks about is Hegel's master-slave relation. And here he talks about the way one child will show off for the other, and that this is the master, and the other one gazes on, totally absorbed by what this kid's doing, and that's the slave. And so this relation, this is where we first kind of see more complex relations coming into play. This is that explosion of sociability. But what that leads to is, in particular, two things that are important for us: jealousy and sympathy. So in the first, jealousy, Merleau-Ponty defines this as basically a confusion between the self and the other. So he says one's existence is invaded by the other and they feel dispossessed by them. And you can imagine that, I think quite it's a nice description of what it is to be jealous, right? That kind of, the other person has, their being has invaded you. It kind of takes over you, and you feel just great expressions, dispossessed by them. But again, only possible because this is a syncretic system, me and other. We're not two discrete entities. If we were, it's hard to see how jealousy could really get a hold of us. Right? There has to be some identification of me, of the other and me going on here in order for me to feel jealousy. And that carries through into adulthood as well. Right? So it's exactly the same process for the adult. And the other feature of this that I meant, these relations that I mentioned, was sympathy. And so this is referring to the way that we copy, imitate the behavior of others. And he describes this as the ensnaring of me by the other. So again, a nice kind of rich description of what it is to feel, or to imitate others, to want to imitate them even. And we see this in the way that when we see someone do something and then we want to copy them, we have to reorient our motor conduct as if we knew how to do what they're doing. So we see what someone else is doing, and we're able to change the way that we take up the world as well, so that it matches what they are doing. And really, this is really important, I think. And I think this is from Phenomenology of Perception. Merleau-Ponty talks about, I think he takes an infant's finger and pretends to bite it with his, so opening and closing his mouth, making that biting movement, and the infant imitates him by doing the same thing, opening and closing its mouth. And the question then is, how is that possible? We talked about seeing an image of someone's mouth and then mapping that onto your own body, which you've never seen. It's only possible if we have this central kind of background on which we're living, the world. So only if the world is a connecting feature here, then that's the only way in which this makes sense. This type of these types of sympathetic imitations can make sense. And again, related to the postural function by which I come to know my body, not primarily as a mass of sensations I receive internally, but through my interactions with the world. And it's that which connects me to the other's body. I'm not going from my body to the world to the other's body. It's that my body and the other's body are in the world. And so there's that, it's happening, everything's playing out in this common realm. And it's that which is the connection. It's that which, because the other's body, I can see it, and I relate to it in the same way that I relate to my own body, because my body is not primarily something I know intellectually from the inside. It's something I experience through my relations with the world, and that's how I know the other's body as well, through the way that the other's body relates to the world. So it's this. We're really just. It's all kind of connected in this system, me and other, and really the whole idea of imitation, I think, is a really good demonstration of that syncretic system, me and other, the way that it plays out, that I understand my body, I understand the other's body through the way that I and the other take up the world, the way that we relate to the world. And again, obviously, this imitation, this sympathy, is something that we see as adults, we experience as adults as well. And it's what underlies our ability to see someone do something and then copy them, be able to do what they're doing, even though we've never done it before. We're able to intuitively grasp how or see how we need to move, how we need to organize our bodies in space when we see someone else do something that we want to copy. And it's something that I think when you think about it, it's more than just intellectual. It's more than concepts. It's more than an analogy. You're engaging in the world the same way that the other is, and the connection is deeper than just a mental one. You're not performing calculations. You're not calculating distances and angles, and I experienced this the other day actually when I was playing tennis. So I'd watched some videos of Roger Federer playing tennis during the day, and then I went and played after work. And as I was playing, I had the image of Federer making his strokes in my mind, and it's hard to explain, but I felt, it's like the image that I had of Federer was kind of playing through me, and I was able to kind of conform or to move in the way that I could picture Federer doing in my mind, and none of this has anything to do with, there's no calculations, it's not even intellectual, it's not something mental, it's something that you feel rather than think, and that's why it's so difficult to explain, because it's only when you actually experience. But most of us have experienced that. I think if you'll easily come up with examples of your own where you kind of take on the movements of someone else, and you're not. It's not an intellectual activity. In fact, if you try and think about it, you'll often find yourself making mistakes. It's when you let go of that and just act. That's when you're able to tap into the power of imitation, I guess, sympathy. So that's a nice kind of demonstration of this system, me and other, and the way that we know our bodies, not as something which only I have access to, but which is something in the world, something out there, external. Okay, so anyway, that's enough of that. The next section we'll look at is what Merleau-Ponty calls the crisis at 3 years. So here what happens is, now we get that break. Now the child stops confusing him or herself with the situation. They stop associating themselves with others. And they start recognizing themselves above or beyond the situation that they're in. And at this stage, then, the other's gaze now becomes an annoyance. Whereas in the past, it was encouraging, right? To see the other looking at you, to the other smiling at you. That was an invitation to take up those behaviors, to engage, to act. Now, when people are looking at us, now we feel annoyed. Now we want them to leave us alone. So there's this sense of separation. There's this sense that I'm me and you're you, and we're different. And so at this time, at this age as well, duplicity emerges for the first time. The child takes things from others that they don't even want. They start interfering with others for pleasure. None of these acts are possible if you're in a syncretic system, me and other. If you're totally caught up in the situation around you, in your surroundings, in what the other's doing. And so we have that division now kind of manifesting. The system me and others no longer characterized by division. I've explained that. But importantly, and as I mentioned at the beginning, that system me and other is not abolished as much as pushed away, as much as suppressed, I guess, maybe one way to think about it. And it resurfaces, or it never goes away, but it appears in adulthood in limiting situations, which is to say situations that are important emotionally, in particular, emotionally important situations. Then we get this, we get a glimpse of this deeper reality, this deeper connection with the other that we had in childhood, and it's always there. It's always underlying our more divided relations, which come on top. The example he gives is love, where we feel ourselves torn away from ourselves. I mean, having that other person, that's such a close, intimate relationship with one other person. It's the way Merleau-Ponty describes it is to consent to love or to be loved is to consent also to influence someone else to decide to a certain extent on behalf of the other. So it's you're binding yourself. It's not the word I'm looking for. You're bound up with the other in a way in which exactly we were describing before, that first phase, that system, me and other. My experiences and the other's experiences, all they're combined in this totality where we're just separate poles. But and we get a taste of that again in this deeper experience of love. And I'll mention it just because Merleau-Ponty mentions it, the word transitivism, which means the absence of a division between me and others. This transitivism is surpassed in immediate daily life, but never in the realm of the feelings. So it's in those feelings, it's in those limiting situations where which are important or which define us in some way. Those are where we encounter this connection, that the system me and other that never left, we never fully escaped, we never fully abolished. So it's always there underneath our ordinary relations with people. So basically then what we have here is the way he's taken the way we typically think about development from childhood to adulthood, and in a sense reversed it. So we usually think we're isolated first. That's our original way of being. Is we're separate. Obviously, that has to develop as we're growing up. But that's what's primary. That's what's originary. We're isolated. We're separate, and we try and bridge that later. So we try and that's the philosophical problem. How are we able to bridge this gap that is there between me and the other? So we try and bridge that later. But Merleau-Ponty's model, according to him, we are that gap is never there originally. Originally we were connected. We shared this totality, this system, me and others. But it's only after we have this crisis at 3 years. It's only afterwards that we separate ourselves, that we come to think of ourselves as independent, individual, isolated from the other. So it's a nice kind of reversal of the way we normally think about things, and it explains some things that I think can't be explained otherwise. We do feel there's a connection with others. It feels stronger than just inferring, just making an analogy, and this kind of taps into that and explains that in a way that makes a bit more sense, I think. So there's one last thing I wanted to mention here. It's an objection that occurred to me. Maybe you might want to say, well, okay, so you've got this system, me and others, it's totality, you and the other are just parts of this system, but maybe that's just wrong. Maybe that's the way that babies think they're experiencing the world, or that's the way that they think the world is, or the way that their relations are. But in fact, they're separate. They're separate entities. They were separate entities when they were born, and they'll be separate entities until they die. And whether they think that they're in this totality is irrelevant. You might take that line, but that's a very materialistic approach that completely ignores conscious experience, right? Phenomenology. It's just saying, a baby is a different entity from its caregiver. Therefore, they're separated by space. There's no connection there. Definitions being definitions, the baby is separate from the caregiver. But that's not, we're not undertaking a scientific description here, or a scientific account of the world, of people and their relations to others. We're looking to describe an experience. We're looking to describe and understand a phenomenological situation, not a material one, not a scientific one. So it's no good to say that babies are wrong. That's not the way it is, because that is their experience. And that experience, whether it doesn't match the physical facts, is irrelevant. Their experience is one of a totality, and that's what we need to explain. That's what we need to understand if we're going to understand the relation that the child has with others. Relation is something it's fundamentally experiential, phenomenological. It's not something which you can break down and analyze with formulae or with numbers. It's not scientific. So the experience, just in virtue of the experience happening, is valid. The experience is the relation. The relation is the experience. It doesn't make sense to say the relation is wrong, or they think something that's not actually true, because their thinking is the relation. It is their connection. And it also doesn't change the fact that it obviously doesn't change the fact that I still have a private domain which no one else can access. No one can know me the way that I know me. No one can have that kind of access. But Merleau-Ponty's point here isn't that they do. The point is that we are more than that. The point is that myself is that those thoughts that only I have access to, those first person experiences, aren't the only dimension of consciousness. Consciousness is also and more so out there externally. It's directed towards the world. It's manifest in my actions. Action, that's really what it boils down to, this idea that the way that we relate to the world, our actions in the world are who we are, not those isolated thoughts that are internal and that only I'm privy to. Sure, that's a part of me. It's a part of who I am. It's a part of myself. But it's the bigger part of me is the way that I'm connected to the world. And exactly the same thing can be said for my body. So that objection, I think, just it doesn't really get to the core of what Merleau-Ponty is talking about in this essay. Okay, the final section in this video, we're going to look at just very briefly at an article written by philosopher Joel Kruger called Merleau-Ponty on Shared Emotions and the Joint Ownership Thesis. All right, so this it's worth looking at this article. It's very short. It's only a few pages long, but it's really it's nice. There are some nice points he makes, and I'm only going to make three. The first is he talks about the way that babies are almost entirely dependent for their phenomenal states on their caregivers, which we looked at already. That was that first 6 months. But he goes a little bit further and defines this as the baby having no attentional or emotional agency. So they've just got they don't have any capacity to direct themselves in any way. They don't have any control over either their attention or their emotions. They're like a boat on the sea. They're just moving wherever the tides take them. And so this is, he points out, a non-dual way of relating to the world. And that, by the way, is what joint ownership thesis is. It means, as Kruger defines it, there's one experience but multiple subjects. So we have that, and so that was a nice fleshing out of that idea. There's no attentional and emotional agency. He also talks about William James here, who mentioned something interesting. He said, since inner control of attention is important in self-consciousness, that's the reason why infants lack this isolated psyche, because they don't have that sense of controlling their own attention or controlling their own emotions or their own reactions. They have no sense of agency. And it's because that's so important in self-consciousness and the sense of being a separate self, that's why infants don't have this sense of separate self. That's why they have this this me and others. They live in this me and others totality. And that was a nice insight. And the other thing I wanted to mention just briefly is Kruger talks about Alison Gopnik, who says she thinks babies are more conscious than adults even. And the reason she says this is because for them consciousness is an encompassing lantern instead of a focal spotlight. So that was an interesting idea, I thought. Consciousness being, it's kind of spread out over a wider area than we normally think of consciousness as being, or that we normally direct our consciousness in a very focused, narrow zone. But for a baby, that's more spread out. So in a sense, they're more conscious than we are. Interesting ideas anyway, worth reading. Okay, let's have a look at a summary. So I'm just going to summarize Merleau-Ponty's model. We looked at the way consciousness is originally turned outwards. So it's principally, it's primarily a manner of relating to the world. So it's externally directed rather than this internal realm of my private thoughts, feelings, desires that we normally think of consciousness as being. Also, the other important point was that our body is a postural schema, which is known, like consciousness, in relation to the world. So it's known, again, primarily through the world, not through the internal sensations we receive from our limbs. In terms of development, originally we live in this anonymous collectivity, which is total in the first 6 months, no extroception, everything is internal. And then after 6 months, we get this syncretic system, me and other, developing. And we saw that the specular image was crucial to that development. And we looked at the way that the master-slave relations emerged from this as well. And in particular, we focused on jealousy and sympathy, and the way that they really only make sense in a system where the me and the other are not completely isolated or divided. Then the next part of that development is the system me and other becoming divided, which happens at around 3 years old, the so-called crisis at 3 years. And the last point I wanted to make is that this early me and other system, this early totality, carries over into adulthood. So it's always there. It's not something we ever transcend or surpass. It always underlies our relations with others, because it's who we are, because the self is not an internal isolated thing, because my body is not something which is only knowable to me, because these things are out there. They're always there, they're always present, but just underneath our normal, typical, everyday relations with people. And that's this essay done. So hopefully you got something from that. I feel like I might have rambled a little. I always feel like I rambled by the time I get to the end of these videos. But it's a good essay to read. It's very interesting, fleshes out some ideas that are really core to Merleau-Ponty's philosophy. So very much recommended reading. I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for listening as always, and I will catch you in the next video. We'll just keep going with phenomenology of perception. Thanks again. See you guys.